Well, hello there and welcome to this revision video on the topic of Germany and the growth of democracy. We're going to be focusing in this video about Kaiser Wilhelm II and the difficulty of ruling Germany between 1890 and 1914 before the First World War. We're going to talk about the growth of parliamentary government, the influence of Prussian militarism, including the idea of Weltpolitik. We'll look at industrialization, social reform and the growth of socialism, and the domestic importance of the navy laws. So, without further ado, let's find out more. So our story begins in 1871 with the formation of Germany. So it's important to understand the context that Germany didn't actually exist as a country until 1871 when it united after defeating France in the Franco-Prussian War. Now, as you can see on that map, Prussia was the most powerful of the Germanic states, and it came to dominate the Germanic government when it united in 1871. And now the Prussian military was particularly significant, and the Prussian military generals exerted quite a lot of influence over the German government before the First World War, certainly influencing Kaiser Wilhelm's policy of the Weltpolitik, which means world politics, and is the idea to explain how the Kaiser wanted to have a German empire, or a place in the sun, as it was sometimes referred to as. Now, it's interesting to note, after World War I, a lot of Prussian land was given to the new state of Poland, including the Polish corridor, which was seen as quite controversial. The Polish corridor gave Poland access to the sea. Today, much of what used to be Prussia lies in territory to the east of modern Germany, in places such as Poland. Okay, so the central figure in this part of the course is, of course, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Now, at this time, Germany was ruled over by a Kaiser who ruled over all of Germany's states, and each of the states, such as Prussia or Bavaria, for example, sent a representative to consult with the Kaiser on any new laws. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm II, he became the German Kaiser at the age of 29, so relatively young, in June 1888. And this is because his father, who's pictured there, Frederick III, died very unexpectedly, actually, after only ruling for 99 days. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm was related to the royal families of Russia and Great Britain. He was the eldest grandson of Queen Victoria, and this meant that Wilhelm, particularly in his youth, visited England regularly, and he was an admirer of the English Navy in particular. And this, I think, helps to explain how Germany and Britain got into this sort of navy race before the First World War. But Kaiser Wilhelm certainly looked towards Britain as something that he wanted Germany to be like Britain. And you can see that in sort of the tension and rivalry between the two countries before the First World War. Now, as a character, Wilhelm was very energetic and enthusiastic, but he also had a very bad temper. It's also worth noting that when he was born, as a result of an accident through a breech birth, he actually had a withered left arm, which he couldn't really control, and therefore he grew up with a disability. But being within the royal family, he was expected to be able to do everything else that people could do at the time, so a lot of pressure was put on him, and I think this helps to understand a little bit about the character of Kaiser Wilhelm II. He certainly had a lot of resilience and determination, but he could also have quite a cruel streak. So this is a little anecdote of how the chief of the military cabinet once collapsed and died whilst performing for the Kaiser dressed as a ballerina. So we get the impression that Kaiser Wilhelm II is quite a complex individual, certainly a fascinating individual. Now, in terms of his sort of guiding political philosophy, he believed in the idea of the divine right of kings. He wanted to rule as an autocrat in a time really where Germany was industrializing and there was pressure for there to be certainly more of a sharing power, if not democratic pressure. He, however, strongly believed in the military. He wished to establish a policy that we've talked about called Weltpolitik, where Germany would become a world power. He also underscored really his autocratic principles when he said to the Reichstag, which was the German parliament, "There is only one ruler, and I am he." So Kaiser Wilhelm, when he became the leader of Germany, he basically had two key aims. The first one is to rule as an autocrat. We've talked about Bismarck and about how his father had let Bismarck make the important decisions. Wilhelm didn't get on with Bismarck and basically forced him to resign. The Kaiser didn't have much respect for the German Reichstag. He very much believed in the divine right of kings, that a king should be able to make whatever decisions they wanted to. His other aim is Weltpolitik, and we can see there a cartoon. It's a British cartoon, actually, showing the sort of the Kaiser reaching out for control of Europe during this time. He wanted Germany to be a world power. He believed that that Germany should have an overseas empire, just like Britain and France. So Weltpolitik is a key concept for you to learn and remember. So this slide just gives you an overview of what Germany was like between 1890 and 1914. So we can see some key themes here that we're going to explore in a bit more detail later on in the video. So there's the influence of Prussian militarism. The German economy has grown massively during this time. There's the influence of the Junkers as well, who are Prussian landowners, very influential in German politics. You get the idea that Prussia very much dominates this new German state. Industrialization, the population increases by about a third during this time, from 49 to 68 million. The German army is becoming more powerful, and then trade unions, this sort of rising industrialization sees more people joining trade unions to gain more rights, basically. So we've looked at some of the features. This is how Germany was governed before the First World War, and there's a few kind of key concepts and key ideas for you to be aware of here. So you've got the Kaiser right at the top, inherited the throne, ruled for life, controlled the army, was commander-in-chief, could propose new laws. They could do things like get rid of the German parliament, the Reichstag, if they wanted to as well. The Reichstag, the German parliament, is elected every 3 years. It could agree or reject laws proposed by the Kaiser. The government needed the Reichstag to agree on how money could be spent and collected via taxation. It was elected by men over the age of 25, for example. Now then there's the Chancellor, the role of the Chancellor. Now when the Kaiser became the ruler of Germany in 1888, his Chancellor was Otto von Bismarck, who had been pretty hands-on with previous leaders like Frederick III, etc. But the Kaiser wanted to take a bit more direct control. So by about 1890, the Kaiser had fallen out with Bismarck and pretty much forced Bismarck to resign, to be honest. This very much shows the sort of hands-on approach that the Kaiser took to his leadership during this time. Having said that, the Chancellor was similar to like a Prime Minister, really. The Chancellor could propose new laws, but as we've seen there, they could be dismissed by the Kaiser. Now, the Chancellor, it means leader, and that's obviously an important position. Into the Weimar Republic, that idea of a chancellor remains. You probably know that Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in January 1933. So in terms of development of democracy during this time, so we talked about how men over the age of 25 voted, and they began to vote for different political parties. One of the most popular ones by the end of the era just before the First World War, so just before 1914, it was the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, and they very much wanted to improve working and living conditions. And I think their popularity probably increased as more and more workers were moving to the cities, and there was more interest in laws to protect people's working lives and to improve living conditions and bring things like social insurance, unemployment benefits, pensions, that type of thing. Not dissimilar, to be honest, to some of the changes that was happening in Britain before the First World War as well. So many of these left-wing liberals as well within Germany, German political system at that time, were wanting Germany to become a democracy. So then the Kaiser had a number of different problems in ruling Germany during this time. His first problem was the growth of parliamentary government. And this basically, we're sort of seeing Germany as a developing democracy during this time. Now, the Kaiser himself relied on what were called the German conservatives to help him pass different laws. And basically during the 1900s, these types of political parties began to decline. There was a rise in left-wing political parties, such as left-wing liberals, and of course the Social Democrats. And this very much put pressure on the Kaiser to bring in more democracy, but crucially also more laws to try and give the workers what they wanted, as I've said before, in terms of better working conditions, living conditions as well. Kaiser was pretty resistant to this, but you can see some of the stats there. Huge increase between 1907 and 1912 in terms of the support for the SPD in particular, the Social Democratic Party. So the other problem the Kaiser had, therefore, was the growth of socialism. Now, industrialization led to a growth of a working class in Germany. People moved to the cities to work in new factories. They wanted their working and living conditions to improve. So the SPD became the largest political party in the Reichstag and led to quite a lot of tension between the sort of more left-wing liberal groups and the right-wing conservative groups that were, of course, much more loyal to Kaiser Wilhelm II. Now, the Kaiser responded to this problem of, industrialization and the growth of socialism and the growth in the support with the SPD through a mixture of both reform and repression. Now, the Kaiser's first chancellor that he appointed during this time, Leo von Caprivi, he brought in some reforms such as banning employing children under 13, Sunday working was banned. Another chancellor that he had from 1900, Chancellor von Bülow, introduced social reforms, pensions and insurance benefits. But one of the problems the Kaiser really had, which he couldn't really do much about, was rising food prices in the early 1900s. And that was a real problem. That was creating real poverty for people within Germany during this time. The Kaiser also responded with repression. So in 1894 is when he got rid of Caprivi as Chancellor. He was a more reform-minded Chancellor, Caprivi. Wilhelm felt threatened by the Social Democrats. Their leaders were attacked and put on trial. And in 1898, Wilhelm made a quite famous speech where he said any worker who went on strike should be put in prison. Really, the Kaiser wanted to use repression. He wanted to be autocratic, but he knew that he had to bring in some reform at the same time as well. So another thing that the Kaiser had to cope with was the impact of industrialization on Germany. Now, in many ways, this created new opportunities within Germany. So things like the production of iron and coal doubled. By 1913, Germany was producing as much coal as Britain and more iron and steel. It was producing about 2/3 of Europe's steel, actually, by 1914. Germany dominated in industries like electrical goods and chemical industries. These were new industries. See there a picture of the BASF chemical factories in Ludwigshafen in Germany in 1881. Factory and business owners becoming rich and influential. Standards of living improved, and as we've seen, the population of Germany increased between 1890 and 1914. Now, this population increase created pressure. Living conditions were poor. There were outbreaks of disease within the city, such as cholera. Gap between rich and poor was growing. Agricultural production did not increase at the same rate, which meant that food had to be imported, and that led to high food prices, which created some real poverty. There's also immigration rates were quite high to ensure there was enough workers within Germany, but that could sometimes fuel social problems, and there's some instances of racism towards people that had come to work in Germany from abroad. Anti-Semitism was also growing in Germany before the First World War, and Germany was actually in debt. It borrowed an awful lot of money due to the industrialization. Also, the Navy laws, which we'll talk about in just a moment, owed about 489 billion marks by 1913. And that's certainly a useful stat when you're thinking about the fact that Germany was then going to fight a war and then have to pay reparations as a result of the First World War as well. So we've already got the impression from the video about the importance and power of Prussia and how very much Prussia was a very dominant state within Germany, and the Prussian military generals exerted a huge influence over Kaiser Wilhelm II. Historically, Prussia was the most powerful of the Germanic states, and basically it was within the Franco-Prussian War, it was Prussia's war with France that essentially led to the formation of Germany in 1871. Now, the leaders in the armed forces, especially the army generals, were kind of like advisors to the Kaiser, and Wilhelm listened to them, and it often caused problems, and it meant certainly by the end of the First World War in 1918, they were effectively running the country, to be honest. Also, having such a huge army was very expensive. The Kaiser needed to get the Reichstag approval for military spending. So we start to get this real tension between sort of like the right wing in Germany before the First World War that are supportive of the sort of Prussian military generals and the idea for Weltpolitik, and then the more left wing sort of liberals, Social Democratic Party that are wanting the money to be spent, for example, on helping the workers and bringing in more benefits for the workers and improving living and working conditions. And that tension really plays out, especially over the actual Navy laws when they're brought in from 1898. So the Navy laws, Kaiser Wilhelm II, we've talked about how he had a policy of Weltpolitik. Lovely little cartoon there about Kaiser Wilhelm II, produced around 1900. Now, the German Foreign Secretary, who was called Prince Bernhard von Bülow, famously said, and this is a nice quote worth remembering, in one word, we wish to throw no one in the shade, but we demand our own place in the sun. And that's a really important quote to remember. You see, the Kaiser wanted a navy to match the British Navy. We talked about how he'd spent time in England, in Britain, when he was younger, grandson of Queen Victoria. So the leader of the navy was called Admiral von Tirpitz, and he argued that in order for Germany to be powerful, in order to achieve their aim of Weltpolitik, they needed to build up an empire, and in order to do that, they needed large battleships. And this led, of course, to the Navy laws. So the first naval law came in 1898, agreed that 7 more battleships would be built. Germany already had 12 battleships at that stage. Second naval law would have doubled the size of the German Navy, bringing the total number of battleships to 38. So you can see there those 2 naval laws are really important for you to be aware of. There's a nice little picture there of Admiral von Tirpitz, who became the Secretary of State of the Navy in 1897. Now this has huge consequences in Germany because it increases Germany's debt and leads to higher taxes. We've already said how Germany owed 489 billion marks, but 24% of Germany's annual spending was on the Navy. Now, that's a huge amount of money to be spending on the Navy and on the military. If you think about it, there's sort of like nowadays in 2022, the sort of NATO requirement for NATO countries to spend on their military is about 2% of annual spending, so 24% is absolutely massive. And this, of course, leads to an arms race, and it leads to alliances being signed. Germany, of course, signed an alliance with Austria, Hungary, and Italy before the First World War. Yeah, so just picking up about German foreign policy pre-World War I. Germany developed this empire in 1913, and the countries that are in the German Empire are Kaiser Wilhelm's land, which is in modern-day Papua New Guinea, the Marshall Islands, German East Africa, German West Africa, which is part of modern-day Cameroon, and German Southwest Africa. And it's just important for you to know about these foreign policy agreements pre-1914. So there's Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Their alliance since 1882 was known as the Alliance of the Central Powers. In 1904, Britain and France signed the Entente Cordiale, and when that was joined by Russia in 1907, that became the Triple Entente, and that pretty much were the sides that we had in the First World War. So there's a little summary here of some of the main features of Germany before the outbreak of World War I, just for you to kind of think about in terms of your revision and some of the key elements that we have looked at within this revision session. So thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that, and good luck. Thank you.